Hey everybody, I wanted to give some thoughts on the recent publication by Stanford University of a list of harmful terms, harmful language that we should avoid. And they didn't really ban the words outright, but they did say that we should avoid using these words. And they had a little blurb about the context of different terms and why they might potentially be problematic. I guess those might be considered microaggressions. The two words I wanted to focus on in particular that they were on the list among the many are American. So they're recommending that we don't use the term American anymore. And I guess Stanford won't be using that term in any of their official university literature, if you can imagine such a thing. The United States of America and Americans. And the other term, in a related sense, is African American. And if you think about what great meaning that term American holds for all of us, it's really kind of appalling that a major university that has been so blessed by America would ban this term. It's also so offensive that to say that there's something wrong with that term American. Now I get that they might think, well, Canada's part of America and Latin America's part of America. You have Central America. Well, that's fine. They can call their areas whatever they want. But we've grown up with the language in this country where we say American, and there's nothing wrong with that. I've been in academia for 35 years, just to introduce myself a little bit. And I've been a college professor for most of those 35 years, so I've seen a lot of change. And probably one of the biggest changes is these kinds of cultural issues, which were already there when I started, particularly at bigger schools. Some smaller schools were kind of little oases still, and they're a lot harder to find. But particularly big schools, some of these issues were already around in the 80s. But I think they've grown much more rigid and kind of bureaucratized and institutionalized, and I think that's really too bad, where they almost sort of eclipse the whole point of learning in some cases. But I wanted to say a little bit about that because in particular, the terms American and African American, and just let me kind of remember a little bit. When I started in academia, I was at a big graduate school. I won't say its name, but it was a big school, and it had a large state presence. And we heard a lot back then about affirmative action, which was quite a big deal. Now, this would be in the 80s, so I imagine some places in the 80s you didn't hear that much about affirmative action yet, but actually at some schools like this, you already heard a lot about affirmative action. And that term was almost exclusively used for black people, for African Americans. And I distinctly remember reading in some of the, college catalogs, university statements, that African Americans had been oppressed for centuries and, just treating everybody in some sort of neutral way wasn't sufficient, and some groups that were, and it specifically said black African Americans that have been historically disadvantaged should receive maybe special consideration, not necessarily unfair advantages, but if all other things being equal, you should take that into account. And that was sort of what I remember affirmative action being, and I very specifically remember that being about black people. And I think most decent people realize that we do come from a history of slavery, and those scars remain, and that's just part of the reality of America's past. But already by the 90s, I think you were starting to see that term affirmative action kind of go away. And one of the first changes I remember seeing, and I actually can remember some fairly specific examples where it started to come up, was in the hiring of white women and the promotion of white women. Whether you think that was fair or not, I mean, I'm just telling you what I witnessed. That was definitely the case, and you started seeing a lot of women college presidents, which sometimes worked all right, but sometimes, like anything, it didn't necessarily work out that well in a lot of cases. But we did go through a period where there were a lot of women as college presidents, and there was a big push to promote women and hire women, which I sort of think is passing at least a little bit, if not for any other reason, because women have become such a strong force in universities. If you're not careful, you end up being sort of a pink collar place, and uh, having a place that's 60% female changes the dynamic. Maybe you think it changes it in a good way or not, but it definitely changes the dynamic. STEM subjects have become really what drives a lot of major universities, and that STEM subjects is where a lot of the academic excellence and rigor is almost on steroids. And I think that's because the humanities have been so gutted out by all these reforms of the curriculum, and nobody really can ever tell you straight up what the humanities are supposed to be. When I first started out, it was, all college graduates should take a good literature course, and that usually was U.S. American Lit. There I'm using that term, American Lit, or British Lit, which is another term, by the way, I think they've gotten rid of. They don't want to be the English Lit department because that might imply English is for, people from England, and English is a world language. So I think they're even moving away from the term English Lit or British Lit for similar reasons, which is sort of sad when you think about all the great use of language that's come out of the English speaking peoples in England and America and elsewhere, but certainly those would be the two major areas, England and America. But anyway, I do think there was an attempt to kind of broaden things. So now you have this situation where the STEM subjects drive universities so much. A lot liberal arts colleges, these small little liberal arts colleges, were 40 years ago. Everybody took seminars in Shakespeare and philosophy. I'm not saying that doesn't still happen, but I definitely think it's become more of a sort of an elective option in a lot of cases, and not just some course in critical thinking. I'm talking about courses where you read sort of canonical works, like in philosophy, that would be the major figures of Western thought, U.S. history, American history. Those were always kind of the big subjects back in those days, and I think there's been a big change, and partially because of some of these moves made by administration to become so diverse that and a lot of that pushed the humanities into almost kind of, they can't really ever say what they're trying to teach, other than critical thinking or professional development. That's the other thing that's happened, is a lot of disciplines like history, literature, even freshmen and sophomores, it's focused on majors, and getting people ready for graduates. And meanwhile, the STEM subjects have just maintained all the rigor in terms of having like 100 level courses, 200 level courses, sequential ordering of courses. That's always a good clue that a discipline hasn't really been all carved up by and turned into some kind of a spoiled system. If they still have sort of a coherent system of sequential ordering and prerequisites, that sort of tells you that the discipline is still coherent. Now, when I started out, English and history and philosophy were more coherent in that way than they are now. I'm not trying to sound bitter or anything. I'm just telling you my experiences, having been in academia for 35 years. But the term that's replaced it is kind of diversity. And I think when you think about the difference between diversity and like affirmative action, we are going to, take proactive measures to help some of these historically disadvantaged groups. And diversity is a pretty different can of worms. It's a pretty different kettle of fish, and sometimes it's not all that well defined. But one of the things that happened, they started emphasizing diversity because it was a more inclusive term. So, if there's anything academia likes, it's like it's being inclusive. So diversity was actually, in a weird way, a more inclusive term. I guess you could argue it was a less stigmatizing term, but it was also a more inclusive term. so it could include more people. And another group I remember seeing kind of rise to the fore in terms of diversity was the LGBTQ community. And I think that's another major development in academia, whatever you think about that. We should all treat people fairly and decently, obviously, and avoid prejudice in terms of people's lifestyle choices. I think most of us would agree with that. But I do remember how that became more of a political and institutional focus. I still remember, I actually remember where I was, and it was around probably 93, 94, 95 ish. And I heard a couple people talking about an LGB center, which I think at the time was like a little study lounge, and it was kind of controversial. But I specifically remember that term LGB. So they were using the term LGB, and that was lesbian, gay, bisexual. Now a few years later, we started hearing the term LGBT. So the T had been added, and I think that's a good example. I'm not trying to pick on any one of these groups, but that's a good example how the term for diversity and some of the institutional measures, which were originally designed to help black people, were kind of expanded as all these other groups sort of saw the advantages, if you want to call that an advantage. It's not an advantage to be in a discriminated against group, but if you're in a university, some people might say those are advantages. So the T kind of attached onto the LGB. And so then you had even a larger group of diversity. But anyway, I specifically remember how that was kind of expanded. And that happened maybe around 2000. But when I first started out, it was LGB, and I heard that pretty exclusively for a while. And which all brings us to the next point, which is this getting rid of the idea of American, which I see as kind of part of this cycle. You might say it's the end game, but so now we're going to get rid of the concept of American as it applies to the United States of America. And another term that they want to get rid of is African American. Now, I'm not black, so everybody can think what they want, but I think if I were black, that would be pretty offensive. Now, you could say on the one hand, even in my lifetime, I'm not a young man, but I've seen a lot of different terms that were acceptable to describe African Americans, and they're no longer considered that acceptable. But that were kind of the words you would see sort of used in respectable journalism and everything. I'm not talking about ethnic slurs, and those have changed. And African American, I remember at one point kind of replaced black, and I don't know if black was ever officially discouraged, but I do remember seeing that term as sort of a substitute for black. So if you think about it, getting rid of the idea of Americans and African Americans, at least in our language, is kind of a scary thing. And as an American, I find it very scary. When I hear the word American, I do think of the United States of America. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If people from Canada want to call themselves Americans, that's fine with me. It's their business. Thank God we don't have some kind of a Académie Française that monitors our language, so you can say what you want. But I think it's interesting, and I attribute this. Stanford said that this might, stigmatize America as two whole continents, and plus Central America, so 3 different areas. And when we use the term Americans, we kind of mean the United States of America. But I think it goes really beyond that, because I think what's happened is universities now aren't really American. Most universities, especially more expensive, prestigious ones, are pretty international. They're pretty international. They are not American institutions, and I feel like a lot of them would even admit that they're not really American schools. They're international schools. So they go to an American school and they're not really American. So at some point, the term American might make them feel kind of out of place. It's kind of funny, in academia, we were told you should never ask where people are from, which I think is kind of what this is about. You should never ask people where they're from. uh, because particularly people from an international background might feel put off by that. Like, where are you from? I don't know why that would be offensive. I don't mind if people ask me where I'm from. I'm from Detroit, but to each his own. But so I don't ask people that. But we're kind of specifically told, don't ever ask people where they're from. And I think that's kind of what's happening. They're not from anywhere. A lot of them are from their school. If you go to Harvard and you ask all these people from all over the world, where are you from? They're going to say Harvard. They're from Harvard. They're from Yale. They're from Berkeley. That's where they're from. And they're not from America. And they're not really from their home countries or their parents' countries. They're from Harvard. They're from Berkeley. They're from their school. But getting rid of that term American, I find very interesting. The other thing that's kind of related to that is how now, after all the decades now, really decades, going back to Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind, which was an excellent book, Judd Hirsch, Cultural Literacy. I remember a lot of those books. And back then, the big push was to diversify the canon, which was good, multiculturalism. I'm not necessarily speaking against that. But one of the things I think that's happened is that we now have so many people from other countries in our schools that they don't U.S. history to them. It's like learning about the Wars of the Roses or the Opium Wars or something. And it's totally academic. And the reason you study U.S. history isn't just to learn critical thinking. It's to learn to appreciate our great country, including its flaws. I'm not saying we should get rid of its flaws, but the purpose isn't just to learn critical thinking. And if you just say, well, we're studying U.S. history to learn critical thinking, then you might as well study tiddlywinks, because you can probably think critically about tiddlywinks too. Critical thinking is not a sufficient basis for organizing the curriculum. Now, one of the terms that we've been hearing more in recent years is decolonization, and I think that's what this American thing is about. It's about decolonizing the curriculum. And if you think about that, so they're saying like American schools are colonizers. And that's kind of a third world term. I'm not saying colonization is good. It certainly happens in history. But decolonizing the curriculum, that's what this really is. These aren't American schools anymore. We're decolonizing the schools. And if you think about it, if you call yourself an American, or if you call yourself an African American, these are very sad developments for you, because when they decolonize, what they're really going to do is they're going to say, we're not really an American school anymore. We're not even going to use that term. And we're going to have people here from all over the world, and we're not really American. Harvard's not an American school. We have people here from all over the world. We're not an American school. Our students aren't really American. We're not going to call them American. And our black here's the other thing too. A lot of the immigration we've seen in this country has involved people from the Caribbean and Africa, and they are black people, but they are not African American. So I really think one of the reasons they got rid of African American is it was because it was off-putting to the many people from Africa or the Caribbean who come to study and often excel in American universities, African American. So I actually think that's the specific reason Stanford got rid of that term. And this was kind of my long-winded way of saying it. So if your school has a viability, if it has history, if it has a viable salary structure, actual buildings that aren't falling apart, if it has a budget, if it has faculty positions and infrastructure, people are going to want to go there. And they're going to want to go there from all over the world, and not just America. And that's why they're getting rid of the term African American and American. And it's really too bad. And shame on Stanford. Thanks. God bless.